Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. After my last video, which took place in the Governor-General's office in Yarralumla, I thought I would try to do this video on the role of the Queen and the Palace during the Whitlam dismissal from Windsor Castle. Now, I had a pass to get in early before the tourists, so I could do work in the Royal Archives, which is in the Round Tower at Windsor Castle. So one morning, I set up my laptop rather precariously on the wall of the moat and tried to record this video while having soldiers march by me along with curious tradesmen and towards the end some tourists once opening hours began. Unfortunately, in an epic fail, the audio didn't work. So I'm recording it again with a virtual background, but with the live footage on the side to give you the atmosphere of the castle live on a grey, rather ominous day. In my last video, I mentioned that the first reaction of Whitlam to his dismissal was either to ask Kerr whether he had discussed it with the palace or to say he must get in touch with the palace. Either way, Whitlam seemed to regard the monarch as a higher authority who could undo his dismissal. Now, this is quite surprising given that A, Whitlam spent much of his prime ministership trying to cut the colonial links between Australia and the United Kingdom, including things like Privy Council appeals, and B, the Constitution gives the monarch no such power in relation to the dismissal of ministers, or indeed to instruct the Governor-General in relation to that, which I'll come back to. As discussed in my earlier videos, the role of the monarch had come up a number of times as we progressed towards the dismissal. There was the issue about whether the Queen could instruct the state governors to issue writs for the half-Senate election if they acted on the advice of their Premier not to do so. This would have involved the Queen in overriding her Australian state premiers and therefore involving herself in a political controversy in Australia. Moreover, as previously explained, it was the Queen of the United Kingdom, not the Queen of Australia, who exercised powers in relation to the Australian states at that time, which meant that she could only be advised on such matters by her responsible British ministers, not the Australian Prime Minister. Then there was the Sir Colin Hanna affair concerning the critical comments that he had made when Governor of Queensland. While Whitlam could advise the monarch with respect to Hanna's dormant commission to be the administrator of the Commonwealth, he could not advise her to sack him as a state governor. There was also the issue of who holds power under the Commonwealth Constitution. On its face, it appeared as if the Queen held significant power because the Governor-General was her representative under Section 2 of the Constitution, and all executive power in Section 61 of the Constitution is vested in the Queen. However, Section 61 says that this executive power is exercisable by the Governor-General as the Queen's representative. Further, the power to dissolve, summon and prorogue Parliament is expressly given to the Governor-General alone by Section 5 of the Constitution. The same is true of the appointment and removal of ministers. Section 64 of the Constitution gives the Governor-General the power to appoint ministers and says that they shall hold office during the pleasure of the Governor-General, not the monarch. It was therefore the Governor-General alone who had the power to dismiss the Prime Minister and hence the government. But was the Queen the Governor-General's boss, and could she instruct him on how to exercise those powers? Could she instruct him, for example, to reverse the exercise of a power that had been conferred upon him? Whitlam had already been thinking about this as part of his wargaming in the lead up to the deferral of supply. In early September 1975, he requested an opinion from the Solicitor General, Maurice Byers, on the subject. Byers provided his opinion on the 5th of September 1975. Byers concluded that the executive power of the Commonwealth, as exercisable by the Governor-General, may not lawfully be the subject of instructions from the monarch. Equally, he concluded that the power of the Governor-General with regard to the dissolution of Parliament, elections, referendums, and, critically, the appointment of ministers, could not be the subject of instruction. Byers regarded these powers as being exercisable by the Governor-General and not capable of exercise by the Queen, even though he acts as her representative. Finally, Byers also advised that constitutional propriety does not permit instructions, even to the governor of a state, as to his constitutional duties. So Whitlam was well aware of this, even while his office was briefing out to the media that Whitlam would ask the Queen to instruct state governors to issue the half-Senate writs if they acted on the advice of a Premier not to do so. He was also aware that the Queen could not instruct the Governor-General to undo his dismissal. But that didn't stop him from trying, as we now know. Whitlam, however, did his best to lead people to believe that he had not contacted the palace to do so. When Kerr stated that he did not give Whitlam a warning because Whitlam would contact the palace to seek Kerr's dismissal, putting the Queen into the controversy, Whitlam made the following withering reply. He wrote, quote, "To imagine that I could have procured the dismissal of the Governor-General by a telephone call to Buckingham Palace in the middle of the night, it was 2 a.m. in London, is preposterous. To imagine that I would have tried to do so is ludicrous." When Whitlam was asked in a press conference after his dismissal whether he had been in touch with the palace, he said, quote, "The Governor-General prevented me from getting in touch with the Queen by just withdrawing the commission immediately. I was unable to communicate with the Queen as I would have been entitled to do if I'd had any warning of the course that he, the Governor-General, was to take." Now, note that while giving the impression that he hadn't been in contact with the palace, neither quote actually says that. And that's because not long before this press conference, Whitlam had indeed rung the palace, even though it was 4:15 in the morning UK time. As preposterous and ludicrous as Whitlam later suggested that would have been. We know this now from a letter by Sir Martin Charteris to Kerr on the 17th of November 1975. According to the contemporary record of Charteris, Whitlam informed Charteris about his dismissal, that supply had since been passed by the Senate, and that the House of Representatives had then voted no confidence in Fraser and confidence in Whitlam. Whitlam, in fact, called Charteris immediately after that vote had been passed by the House at 3:15 p.m. Canberra time and before the Parliament had been dissolved. He wanted to be recommissioned as Prime Minister, and he wanted Charteris to speak to Kerr about it. In short, he wanted the palace to interfere in Australian political affairs by causing Kerr to change his course of action. When other dismissed premiers or prime ministers have sought to advise the monarch to overrule their dismissal, they all faced the same response, and that was that they were no longer the monarch's responsible minister, and therefore they could not advise the monarch. And that was so in relation to Western Nigeria and Pakistan and Fiji and other places. It would seem likely that the same response was given to Whitlam, although we have no further details. Perhaps when the Royal Archives in the Round Tower finally opens the records of Queen Elizabeth II, which is still some years away, we might find out more. Whitlam, however, must have been embarrassed or ashamed of his action in racing off to the palace. In his book relating to the events of 1975, he only admitted to calling Charteris at the end of the day after the events were over, not in the midst of events while trying to get them overturned. Whitlam was, of course, not the only one. The Speaker of the House of Representatives, Gordon Scholes, also formally requested the Queen to restore Whitlam to office as Prime Minister. He did so on the basis that the House of Representatives, after Whitlam's dismissal, had expressed a want of confidence in the new Prime Minister, Malcolm Fraser, and requested that Whitlam be reinstated. The Queen's Private Secretary responded to the letter from the Speaker as follows. "You ask that the Queen should act to restore Mr. Whitlam to office as Prime Minister. As we understand the situation here, the Australian Constitution firmly places the prerogative powers of the Crown in the hands of the Governor-General as the representative of the Queen of Australia. The only person competent to commission an Australian Prime Minister is the Governor-General, and the Queen has no part in the decisions which the Governor-General must take in accordance with the Constitution. Her Majesty, as Queen of Australia, is watching events in Canberra with close interest and attention, but it would not be proper for her to intervene in person in matters which are so clearly placed within the jurisdiction of the Governor-General by the Constitution Act. End of quote. Now, that analysis was dead right. Interestingly, the letter was initially drafted by an Australian, the Assistant Private Secretary, William Heseltine, at least so he told me, because he had a greater knowledge of Australia and its political and constitutional position than other people in the palace. Now, what about the conspiracy theory that the palace approved or encouraged the dismissal of the Whitlam government or gave it a green light? First, the palace had no interest in doing so. The exercise of a reserve power of dismissal was always going to make the vice-regal role controversial and encourage republicanism. It would have been the last thing that the monarch wanted. Secondly, the palace letters show that Kerr deliberately did not tell the palace what he proposed to do, let alone seek permission for it. He did not want to embroil the Queen in controversy. And this, of course, was standard practice for Governors-General when exercising reserve powers. Moreover, as a lawyer, Kerr knew perfectly well that the power was his alone and that he should not act under the direction of anyone else. The palace letters show that the Queen's private secretary consistently encouraged Kerr not to act precipitately and to only act in accordance with the Constitution. One of the more bizarre interpretations of the palace letters concerns a postscript on a letter by the Queen's private secretary, Sir Martin Charteris, to Sir John Kerr. The letter of the 24th of September 1975 referred to the independence celebrations in PNG and the conversations that Kerr previously reported that he had had with Whitlam there about how to deal with the potential blocking of supply. Charteris added a handwritten postscript. It pointed Kerr to the work of the Canadian constitutional lawyer Eugene Fawsey, saying that Fawsey laid down a principle that if supply is refused, this always makes it constitutionally proper to grant a dissolution. By convention, if a government is defeated on supply, it must resign or secure a dissolution of Parliament resulting in an election. So what Charteris was doing was pointing out that Fawsey considered that it was proper to grant an election to the Prime Minister in such circumstances, rather than dismissing them and appointing someone else. So the words are plain. They talk about the Governor-General acting to grant a dissolution, that is, an election, on the advice of their Prime Minister. Charteris said nothing in that note about dismissing the government. He was instead encouraging Kerr to grant, rather than refuse, any request by Whitlam as Prime Minister for a dissolution and an election. Yet somehow commentators, desperate for a conspiracy, claim that this was an example of the monarch providing not just comfort but actual encouragement to the Governor-General in his sacking of the government. Well, it did no such thing. It's as if commentators just willed the word dissolution into the word dismissal because they both have dis at the front. Despite the absurdity of the claim, it was still spread and is probably still believed by the vast bulk of people who've read the commentary about the palace letters, but not the letters themselves. During the crisis, the only advice Kerr received from the palace was that the exercise of the reserve powers was a very heavy responsibility and that it's only at the very end when there is demonstrably no other course that they should be used. Charteris pointed out that the reserve powers are intended to operate without needing to be used. That is, that they are there to encourage politicians to behave in a measured and constitutional way so that the reserve powers never need to be exercised. The emphasis was always on influence and persuasion to get politicians to behave appropriately, not brute exercises of power. And that's why I called my book on the reserve powers The Veiled Sceptre, because there is a sceptre, a stick, and it is powerful, but it's kept veiled in the background, and ideally its mere existence means that there is no need to wield it. Kerr raised a concern with Charteris that however he acted, it would affect the standing of the monarchy in Australia. Charteris, sensibly, replied that Kerr was in an unenviable position, but if Kerr did what the Constitution dictated, he could not possibly do the monarchy any avoidable harm. Throughout, the palace placed stress on behaviour that was constitutional and measured, but without ever suggesting what action Kerr should actually take. Charteris rightly took the view that Kerr, as a former judge, had a better understanding of the Australian Constitution than anyone at Buckingham Palace. The palace letters show that the palace wanted no involvement in decision-making by the Governor-General. Charteris wrote that while the Queen wanted to be kept informed, this, quote, does not mean that she has any wish to intervene, even if she had the constitutional power to do so. The crisis, as you say, has to be worked out in Australia, unquote. Well, he was right. And it was funny that a Labor government still seemed to think that the monarch should intervene in Australian political affairs, while the palace was more respectful of Australian sovereignty. Because Kerr considered that he should not advise the Queen of his proposed actions, he stopped sending letters to the Queen in the days immediately before he acted. Altogether, the letters make categorically clear that the Queen had no advance knowledge of what Kerr would do. She was only informed after the event when she woke up the following morning. Thank you for watching the Constitutional Clarion. I hope you've enjoyed this series on the Whitlam dismissal, and I look forward to seeing you again next time. Goodbye.